This is the Soul-Filled Sisterhood podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole Burgess, a licensed marriage and family therapist and a soul-led leadership coach to women in midlife who are wanting more meaning in the second half. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute, nor is it to convey professional, psychological, financial, or medical advice. If you could use such services, please seek them out from someone you trust. Episode 150. Hey, if you're liking what you're hearing, I really encourage you to go out to Apple Podcast and leave either a star rating, it's just a simple little click on the number of stars, or you can actually write a review. This really does help the algorithms and things like that from this podcast to be discovered more easily by other women around the world. So appreciate you listening. And now on my website, if you go out to NicoleBurgessCoaching.com and over on the podcast tab, if you click that, there's a little place where you can actually leave me a little audio message. So again, I'm the one that still checks all those things. You can actually leave me a message like what you like, what topics you want to continue to hear on the podcast, and so much more. Thank you so much for listening, and here is today's episode. And before we dive into today's episode, ladies, I just want to give you kind of a heads up that at the time of this recording, I had just gotten a brand new puppy who did not want to really cooperate during our interviews. So I've edited out quite a bit of the barking, but you're still going to hear some. And then towards the end, we were having the technology issues. So there's some breaking up. But for the most part, you're really going to hear all the incredible work that my guest Shayla is doing in this world. And I hope you enjoy this episode. It's very, very powerful. Well, welcome, sisters. My guest today is Shayla Olette Stonechild. As a Métis and Plains Cree woman from, please say the name for me. Muscophegan First Nations. Shayla has always been a catalyst for Indigenous youth and women unlocking their full potential and reclaiming their voices. Shayla is on the forefront of Indigenous women's wellness. She's a trauma-informed yoga instructor with over 500 yoga teacher training hours and has been named, this is so cool, I'm going to pause. She has been named internationally as one of the top 20 yoga instructors of color to watch in 2020. Utilizing her skills as a powerful speaker and thought leader, Shayla is the founder of the Matriarch Movement, a nonprofit organization dedicated to highlighting Indigenous voices and providing wellness workshops to BIPOC women across Canada. Through her work, Shayla hopes to bring difficult yet necessary Indigenous topics into mainstream conversations. From the impacts of international trauma to First Nations life promotion and suicide awareness, she is bringing stories to the light and using her platform for future sustainable change in society. She has a history of collaboration and partnerships with brands such as Paris Jewelers, Audible, Sephora, Expedia, and many more. She has also been featured on CTV, CBC, The Social, and eTalk. In this year, March of 2021, she became the first Indigenous woman to be on the cover of Yoga Journal magazine across Canada and the United States. That, I'm going to say huge congratulations on that, Shayla.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And welcome to this show. And I want to dive in, like, how did all of this really start to transform for you? Like, how did you end up becoming this activist that you're all over the place these days?
Yeah, it's been quite the adventure. I have a lot of interests, as you can see. I'm a Gemini moon. I don't know if you pay attention to astrology, but I like to adapt to a lot of things. And it really started taking off after my teacher training, my yoga teacher training. I spent 2 years really working with my shadow, working with my unconscious behaviors and beliefs, and brought that to the forefront and started really healing from my wounds, and then realizing the power that lies in meditation and movement and natural medicine and reclaiming your own power. And I was like, I want to utilize my gifts and my knowledge and help out others, especially Indigenous people, Indigenous women and youth, realize their own potential and what they can do in just one lifetime.
I love it. I love it. I love it. So share just a little bit more. You talk so much about like the Indigenous reclamation and reimagining and what a future can look like as people of all backgrounds come together. Because again, you're covering so many different topics and really trying to raise awareness for so many folks who just, it's like they're still blind. They don't know what they don't know often, right? And just breaking through old belief systems. So share a little bit more about this part right here that you're talking about.
Yeah, so in Canada, what's happened with Indigenous people over here is obviously like the same when it comes to, the land being stolen, us going through residential schools. I know in the US you have boarding schools. And so there's a lot of similarities between our histories. But one thing that we do have in Canada is the Indian Act, and that was introduced in 1876. And so that stripped us away from our roles within our traditional societies, and it dehumanized us. Yeah, made our voices not matter, and it took away our sense of identity and purpose. The Indian Act policies were not equal among Indigenous men and women, and so they introduced, the chief and council system, which tore away women from their well-respected roles within societies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so we're still dealing with the Indian Act out here in Canada. It's for us to be assimilated into European culture. And so my dad went to residential school, and that led him to being a part of the federal prison system out here, which is mainly made up of Indigenous people as well.
Oh my gosh.
Because of the history that's happened here, and because of what the Canadian government has done to us. And so he was in the prison system, and it eventually led him to take his life. And so I speak of this story because it's very common among First Nations communities. Suicide is the leading cause of death in our communities. And this is all at the hands of the Canadian government and the Canadian state. And so a lot of my work is sharing my story to invite others to do the same, to destigmatize these hard conversations. And also because a lot of people don't know the realities and like all the obstacles that we face as Indigenous people here in Canada.
Well, and it's just, it still amazes me, baffles me, awes me, whatever phrase you want to use, right? It's like, it's 2021 and we're still stifling so many voices. And to be like, I'm not even a human based upon a law that was written and it's still going on. It's like, come on, folks, we've got to do this differently. Come on.
Well, and we're still we have reserves out here, First Nations communities that don't have access to clean drinking water, that don't have access to, basic human needs and rights. And so it's kind of like what's happening in our own backyard here in Canada. A lot of people think that, Canadians are polite and Canadian, all good things happen in Canada, and that's not the case.
Wow.
And so, my goal is to just bring awareness to these issues, to hopefully start advocating for more change, especially when it comes to the government.
Well, and so for you, for those that are in Canada, whether they're entrepreneurs or they're working in the corporate world, what are some things that they can do to start to get involved more? So that, again, this awareness that you're already spreading spreads more, but also begins to help shift maybe the laws and how things are done.
Yeah, so I think one thing is understanding the history. I realize that the education system out here has failed a lot of Canadians, and that's most
they
people.
do that here in the US,
Yeah, and so I think that's what creates harmful stereotypes and biases towards Indigenous people, because people lack the true education on what's happened here. And so I think learning the history is the first step. There's a book called 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph, and he talks all about the policies that were created. And it really baffled me when I read it, because I was like, wow, for example, we could even sell to other farmers, just everything that we were when we're like, okay, we're going to assimilate into your culture, or we're going to try to take on your worldviews by, practicing farming. And then they put laws and regulations against us, so we couldn't sell to non-Indigenous people. So you read this book, and you realize there was no power in us as Indigenous people. Even if we were to assimilate, there was no power. There was nothing. And so
they were never going to give anything to you.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
reading that book like really opened my eyes, and then it provides you the foundation and the blueprint as to why we're currently dealing with everything that we're dealing with right now. And I think
Okay.
people also fail to understand that, the residential school system, it might be a part of our history, but it's also very much in the present because it led to
Yeah.
intergenerational trauma. It led
Uh-huh.
to the child welfare system being mainly made up of Indigenous kids. And so
Yep.
all the things that we're currently against is because of the history. And so I would invite listeners to read that book,
Yep.
to listen to Indigenous voices and other advocates, because there's over 600 nations in Canada alone. And so I
Oh,
cannot
wow.
speak for everyone. Yeah. And so we all have a very diverse language, we have diverse teachings, and we all have diverse history. And so I would invite listeners to also seek out other voices. And then when it comes to like actual change, I believe it starts one with yourself, and
Mm-hmm.
then your friends around you, conversations within your family, and then your support system, and then your community, and then globally. And so that's kind of how I've been working is, healing within myself first, helping out
Mm-hmm.
my support system, helping out my community, and then globally. And there's actually 94 calls to action out here in Canada by the Truth and Reconciliation Report. And so that provides you the foundation and the blueprint into how to start implementing change within your own sector of wherever you're working.
Beautiful. And ladies, I'm going to have a lot of the book that she mentioned and other things. I will have that in the show notes too. So don't worry. You can always go back to the show notes and find more information out. Shayla, it's so fascinating, right? I remember way back when learning about, the Native Americans in our culture, and at the same time, just not a ton actually written. And so I'm like, you're saying there's over 600 nations in Canada. I'm like, I don't have any idea how many there are here in the US. And again, that's my ignorance, right? And so I just love that you are having this conversation and bringing that up. And the intergenerational trauma is huge that has happened. So yeah, to begin to heal that, and again through the mind and body. And I love that you're doing the trauma informed yoga, because that really does help integrate so much as you work through things. Oh, goodness sakes.
Yeah, it's so important. I think healing ourselves as Indigenous people, and if you're from a marginalized community, I think that's the revolution in itself, is taking your power back that was once, still to this day, trying to be taken away,
Oh,
trying to be
totally.
limited, trying to be controlled. It's kind of like that's the revolution.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. It's huge. And you state you want to bring, Indigenous topics into the mainstream conversation. So what are some of those topics? We talked about kind of the suicide awareness, sharing your story for people to get more educated. What other topics do people just truly, they're just oblivious to and don't know what they don't know, that you're like, hey, let me help share a little bit more with you?
Well, I think what's currently happening in Canada, just in June, it was Indigenous History Month, and there was unmarked and mass graves being found within the residential
Oh,
schools. Yeah, so they found 215 in BC, and then I think the number, I don't want to get it wrong, I think it's like over like 4,000 right now, and then they have 4,000 claimed in the Truth and Reconciliation Report. And so we're currently dealing,
wow.
with finding these unmarked and mass graves of Indigenous children and Indigenous people. And so everything that people thought was like, a myth or a folklore, it's like, no, this is
No.
this is the reality that we're facing. And that's also happening in the States. And so I think I'm not so knowledgeable on like the policies that are taking place in the States when it comes to this, but for us in Canada, each nation is currently figuring out how to go about first finding these unmarked graves and mass graves within the residential schools, and then the protocols that follow that. But one thing is demanding that Canada be brought to international courts for genocide and apartheid. And
Yes.
yeah, and I was helping out my friend. She's an MP for Nunavut, Mumlak. She's calling upon the government to implement prosecutors to start prosecuting these priests that harmed Indigenous children and Inuit children in Nunavut. And so there are things that are happening, but what's happening in Canada is that an election was just called too. So there's like so many layers and nuances to this conversations. But I do post a lot on my stories, and I do post a lot in my links on Instagram of calls to action, writing the federal government, writing your MPs, and demanding change within the system.
It just is heartbreaking to hear the mass graves, and it is genocide, right? I mean, it's just like, oh my gosh, I've heard about it in other countries. And again, I'm white. There's so much privilege that I have to go, what? These are kids. These are freaking children.
Yeah, and it's boggles my mind how people dehumanize Indigenous children. If this was white children, I'm sure it would be a lot different.
Oh yeah,
that just goes to show like how racist Canada is.
Yeah, well, and it's everywhere, right? But it just it's so sad that it's like, my gosh, we're in 2021, and now more and more is getting discovered about the secrecy, what has been hidden, what has literally been buried. And it's like, the people need to be held accountable. It's wow.
Yeah. So June, I burnt myself out, to be honest. I took like 6 weeks off, because that's another thing too, is a lot of people do look to Indigenous voices and do look to advocates and activists, and we take on a lot of emotional labor too, because it's attached to us. It's attached to our bloodline. It's attached to our families. It's attached to our lineage. It's not just me talking about statistics. This is me talking about my father and my bloodline. And so I think also holding space for when Indigenous activists and advocates and voices just need to rest and restore.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, being burnt out and not being able to advocate and talk about it, then it's like, okay, you're not serving us, in the sense that it's like, we want to support you and change everything that is going on. But it's like, you got to take care of you for sure, because that's the foundation. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, you kind of deal with this pressure of like, oh, I should be it's kind of, it's that capitalistic mindset of like, I should always be doing something, or I should always be saying something. And it's just not, it's not realistic.
No, it's not. Totally not. I guess for those... Again, the ladies who were up in Canada and doing some of this research, and they're starting to, recognize, oh my gosh, I don't want to continue this trauma. I don't want to continue this racism. What are some ways they could maybe bring that back into, whether it's the workforce, educational systems, ways that again, like you said, they can start in with their own families and having conversations with their children. They can have conversations with their relatives. They can have conversations with their friends. Are there any other things they could start to do to help even change the school systems, the workforces, so that Indigenous folks also do have a voice and they do become part of, let's open this up more?
Yeah, I think like decolonizing our own mind and our own perception, and realizing the harm that colonization has done to us all and continues to do. We've all been affected by colonization. And so there's a book called Sacred Instructions by Sherry Mitchell. She's an Indigenous attorney, activist, and author, and she speaks about how colonization and capitalism has affected each of our spirits, and how we do have to reclaim Indigenous values, worldviews, plant medicine, and we also have to reclaim our relationships to one another. But I feel like a part of this work is letting Indigenous people lead it. And so I invite you to create space for maybe a person to come, Indigenous person to give a talk, to consult with Indigenous. I know there's a lot of consulting groups out there that actually do this work to implement in your organization or in your workforce. And I would love to see changes within our own educational system out here. I know in Alberta, they are trying to take away even teaching about Indigenous rights and history.
Seriously.
So there's so many, because they don't want the truth to come out. I mean, it's the history repeating itself in a sense. But I would invite to create space for Indigenous voices.
Yeah, and it's very similar to, here where we didn't, I don't remember in our history classes, again, when I was much younger, about the concentration camps we actually had here in our own country, right? It's like, was that not in our history books? It's like, I learned about it much later as an adult. I'm like, we had that here. okay, it wasn't just across the ocean. It was right here in our own country because of the fear. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they're still extracting from Indigenous lands, so that's kind of why it won't be told, because
Gotcha.
they're not done. They're not done with us yet.
Yeah. So the secrecy continues. It's like, oh, we don't want to be called out, and at the same time, it's kind of like, hey, that's part of how we heal, and that's part of how we break through all of this, and don't continue it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why the unmarked graves and the mass graves are being shown, because it is time for the truth to be revealed. I feel like 2021, we have no choice. It's everywhere now. The truth about everything is coming forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so Shayla, I'm curious, is there something, again, I only had like kind of a handful of questions for you. Is there something though that I am missing that you want to share with my listeners, that I've not asked or that I'm not even thinking of?
I think we covered a lot of the history, and I feel like that's the first step. A lot of the work I do is with Indigenous youth and Indigenous women. I run the Matriarch Movement nonprofit and podcast, which focuses on amplifying Indigenous voices and providing a safe and a brave space for us to heal our spirits and our bodies and our power that have been continually silenced, stolen, and suppressed throughout humanity. So I would invite listeners to listen to my podcast. It's on Apple. I would invite listeners to check out the Matriarch Movement for Indigenous voices and Indigenous women's stories of resilience and reclamation.
Beautiful. All right, I'm going to kind of turn the track just a wee bit. So I know you said, you were kind of facing some burnout, and so you were doing some self-care. For a few weeks there. What are some of your self-care practices that you do so that you can really rest your body, your soul, and all of that? What do you do for you?
So I live in Vancouver on the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil Waututh people. I live about 4 blocks away from the ocean, and so I'm very fortunate and lucky to live so close to source, to Mother Earth, to connection to water. And so one of my habits going down and on tobacco and speaking to Creator, to my ancestors, continued guidance, being very specific on what I want to call it. And that usually shows up in my messages, in my dreams that I meet, and the opportunities that I get. And I also have a sacred space and all that, like cleansing. So like I do a lot of baths. I work with flower essences. I work with yoga, meditation, and being in community and coming back to ceremony. Unfortunately, the pandemic, I can't go to sweat, and I haven't been to a powwow yet, but just coming back to my roots and to my Nehiyaw culture and way of life.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I had another podcast guest on a couple years ago who also was into educating and using flower essence. I love that you incorporate, and I know you said that's also just part of your culture too, coming back more to the natural plants and things. So I love that that's part of the self-care process. Lovely.
Yeah. Each flower holds a certain vibration for each emotion, which is great.
It is. I love it. Well, ladies, again, I'm going to have, Shayla's got 2 different websites. One is shaylastonechild.com. The other one is the matriarchmovement.ca because it's up in Canada. And then I'll have her Instagram handle and all that stuff on the show notes as well. Shayla, I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you for being on. Thank you for what you're doing. It is a lot that you're doing. And I'm going to do whatever I can to really support you through all of this as well, and help spread the message. And I'll have the links to the books that you mentioned as well in the show notes for people so that they can read through that and start to change conversations even here in the US so that we can really do a lot of overhaul on so many things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hi, for having me. And I look forward to the work that you're also doing in the world.
Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, I invite you to go out to iTunes and please leave an honest rating and review. In the podcast world, this really helps other women find the podcast and they can see if it resonates with others out there. appreciate all your support and leaving me a rating.